It was a bright and busy morning when a woman entered the prestigious medical clinic in the heart of the city. She was there for a routine checkup, something she did every year without fail. The clinic was known for its excellent care and high standards, attracting patients from all walks of life. As she made her way inside, the woman, who was in her late 40s, walked with confidence. She had always prided herself on her good health, but today she felt a little uneasy. The bustling waiting room, filled with patients from different backgrounds, made her feel slightly out of place. She took a seat, scanning the room. Her eyes wandered over the various people sitting around her, some flipping through magazines, others chatting quietly with friends or family. It was an ordinary day at the clinic, but her mind wasn't focused on the appointments or the people around her. Instead, she found herself thinking about one person in particular, a doctor she had seen walking past earlier. The doctor, who was black, had caught her attention, though not in the way one might expect. She couldn't help but notice his calm, confident demeanor as he moved through the room, heading to a nearby office. To the woman, his presence felt jarring, out of place. It wasn't something she had expected or planned to feel, but there it was. The idea of being treated by him seemed unappealing, despite knowing nothing about his qualifications or expertise. The clinic was large and well respected, and she knew the doctor must have been highly trained. But something about his appearance, about the fact that he was black, stirred something in her she didn't want to acknowledge. Deep down, she felt a wave of discomfort that she couldn't quite explain. She had always considered herself open-minded, but in that moment, something inside her resisted the idea of sitting in front of him. As time passed, the nurse called her name, and the woman stood up, ready to head into the examination room. She followed the nurse down the hallway, but when they reached the door to the doctor's office, she hesitated. The door was open, and the doctor she had noticed earlier was standing inside, waiting for her. Her heart skipped a beat. "I'm afraid I'd like to see someone else," she said, almost nervously, her voice betraying the hesitation she felt. The nurse, a young woman who hadn't expected this, looked confused for a moment. "Is there something wrong, ma'am?" the nurse asked politely. The woman quickly waved her hand, brushing off the awkward moment. No, it's just, I prefer another doctor. I'd rather wait for a different one." The nurse, now looking uncomfortable but not wanting to argue, nodded. "Of course, I'll check if another doctor is available." As the nurse stepped away, the woman sat back down in the waiting area, trying to shake off the feeling of guilt that had begun to creep in. She didn't know why she felt so strongly about avoiding that doctor, but she convinced herself that it was just a matter of personal preference. Still, as she sat there, a part of her wondered if she had made the right choice. The clinic buzzed around her, but her thoughts remained tangled in the moment she had just experienced. She had allowed a small, unexplainable feeling to guide her actions, and now, sitting in the waiting room, she couldn't quite shake the nagging sense that she had done something wrong. But there was no turning back now, at least, not yet. The minutes ticked by slowly as the woman waited in the clinic's waiting room. She tried to focus on the magazines laid out in front of her, but her mind kept drifting back to the doctor she had just refused to see. A quiet voice inside her asked, "Why did you do that?" But she quickly pushed the thought aside, telling herself it wasn't a big deal. She had simply preferred to wait for a different doctor, one she felt more comfortable with. As she sat there, trying to ignore the nagging feeling, she noticed other patients in the waiting area. Some looked relaxed, chatting casually with the people they had come with, while others, like her, sat quietly, alone with their thoughts. The buzz of conversation and the quiet hum of the clinic seemed to grow louder as she thought about the situation. The nurse had left to find another doctor for her, but it had been several minutes, and the woman was beginning to feel a little uneasy. She wasn't sure why, but she just felt a sense of discomfort growing inside her. Eventually, the nurse returned, and the woman looked up with a forced smile, expecting to hear that another doctor had been found. Instead, The nurse's face was a bit more serious than usual. She glanced at the woman and said, "I'm afraid the other doctor is unavailable for today. Dr. Thomas will be seeing you after all." The woman's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected that. She tried to hide her surprise, but her face likely gave her away. Dr. Thomas. It was him. The same doctor she had just avoided moments earlier. She froze for a second, not sure how to respond. Should she protest again? Should she ask to see someone else? But the truth was, the nurse had already made it clear that there were no other options. She would have to face him now, whether she liked it or not. With a deep sigh, she stood up slowly, feeling a sense of dread settle in her chest. She was trying to convince herself it was just a routine checkup, that there was nothing to worry about, but her mind kept returning to the same thought. What if this is awkward? She walked towards the doctor's office, the door open, and there he was, standing tall with a warm but professional smile. He greeted her as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened, as if he hadn't noticed her hesitation earlier. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and confident. "How are you feeling today?" She managed a tight smile, trying to act normal, but inside, her mind was racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to have to face her own discomfort and unspoken prejudice head-on. She had hoped that by waiting for another doctor, she could avoid this moment entirely. But now, here she was, sitting in front of the very person she had turned away from just a short while ago. As he spoke to her, asking about her health and any concerns she might have, she was struck by how professional and calm he seemed. His words were gentle, but his tone was confident. He didn't seem to notice the tension in her, or if he did, he didn't show it. He focused entirely on her well-being, asking the right questions, making her feel heard, and ensuring she felt comfortable. The woman was suddenly ashamed of herself. Here she was, in front of a doctor who was nothing but kind and professional, and she had allowed herself to judge him based on his appearance alone. She hadn't even given him a chance. Her thoughts began to shift, realizing how wrong she had been. But her pride wouldn't let her admit it just yet. She forced herself to stay focused on the appointment, pretending that everything was fine, even though deep down, she knew it wasn't. As Dr. Thomas continued with the checkup, explaining things in detail, the woman started to feel a sense of guilt creeping in. The earlier discomfort, the refusal to sit with him, seemed small now, insignificant. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of having made a mistake that she couldn't take back. And now, as the doctor finished up his questions and prepared to conduct the necessary tests, she wondered, would this be the moment she would truly face what she had done? Dr. Thomas moved with quiet confidence as he continued to ask the woman about her health. He had an easy smile that made her feel at ease, even though she still couldn't shake the awkwardness that lingered from earlier. He explained things clearly, asking questions about her daily routine, any discomfort she might be feeling, and if there was anything that had been bothering her lately. His voice was calm and reassuring, and his manner put her at ease in a way she hadn't expected. As the conversation continued, she began to realize how wrong her initial thoughts had been. Dr. Thomas wasn't just a doctor. He was someone who cared about his patients. It was clear from the way he listened so attentively to every answer she gave, making sure to follow up with thoughtful questions. He didn't rush through the appointment like some doctors she had seen in the past. Instead, he took his time, explaining everything in a way that made her feel heard and respected. It was almost like a shift in her perception had occurred without her realizing it. The discomfort that she had felt earlier started to fade as Dr. Thomas spoke with her about her health in such a caring, yet professional way. It was as if, in those moments, her earlier judgment of him and her decision to refuse him seemed so trivial. The fact that he was a black doctor no longer mattered. What mattered now was that he was a good doctor, one who took the time to explain things and make her feel comfortable, something that she hadn't fully appreciated at first. She couldn't help but notice that his eyes seemed to carry a certain depth, like he had experienced more than most people ever would. Maybe it was because he had worked hard to get to where he was. Maybe it was because he had faced challenges, as many people do, but had never let that stop him from becoming the person he was today. She didn't know his full story, but she could see the quiet confidence he exuded. The feeling she had earlier, of discomfort and hesitation, now seemed unfair, even ridiculous. As Dr. Thomas continued to check her vitals and explain the next steps, she started thinking about her own life and how easy it was to hold on to old prejudices, even if they were unspoken. She realized that she had allowed herself to judge him based on something as superficial as his skin color, something that had no bearing on his ability to be a great doctor. She had fallen into a trap that many people unknowingly fall into, a trap that separated people into categories based on things like appearance, background, or race. But now, sitting in front of him, that divide seemed silly. When Dr. Thomas asked her if she had any questions or concerns, she hesitated for a moment. She thought about asking him something about her health, but then something else came to mind. She looked at him, and with a sigh, spoke up. "You know," she started slowly, "I owe you an apology." Dr. Thomas stopped what he was doing and looked at her with calm eyes, waiting. His face didn't show any judgment or surprise, just patience, as though he had heard such apologies before, but still understood how important it was. "I wasn't very open-minded when I first got here," she said, feeling the weight of her words. I judged you before even giving you a chance, and that was wrong of me." For the first time in the appointment, Dr. Thomas gave a small smile. It wasn't a big gesture, but it felt warm and genuine. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "The important thing is that you recognized it and took the time to reflect on it. That says a lot." The woman felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because she had finally said what was on her mind, and embarrassment because she knew she had done something wrong. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't expected. It was a sense of growth, of learning, of realizing that her own assumptions and biases weren't just harming others, but also keeping her from experiencing the richness of life and relationships with people who were different from her. Dr. Thomas continued with the checkup, but now it felt different. The air in the room wasn't thick with awkwardness anymore. Instead, there was a sense of understanding, of mutual respect. As he finished up, the woman realized that the experience had opened her eyes in a way she hadn't anticipated. She walked out of the room feeling not just physically better, but mentally clearer. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that she wouldn't forget anytime soon. And the next time she was faced with a similar situation, she would be sure to remember what it felt like to be truly seen, without judgment. The woman left Dr. Thomas's office feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt relief that the awkwardness was behind her, but another part felt deeply unsettled. Her mind replayed the moment when she had refused to see him earlier, and the guilt washed over her again. Why had she acted that way? How could she have allowed something so shallow, so trivial, to guide her behavior? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Her view of Dr. Thomas had completely changed. As she sat in the waiting area, waiting to schedule her next appointment, she realized that her thoughts had been consumed by this encounter more than anything else. She kept thinking about how easy it was to fall into old habits, to make judgments based on appearances or assumptions. It wasn't just about Dr. Thomas, but about her. She had allowed herself to be closed off in ways she hadn't even realized. But today, everything had shifted. The nurse called her name, and she stood up, ready to head to the front desk to make her next appointment. As she walked past the doors to Dr. Thomas's office, she felt a strange urge to thank him again, to say something that would express the appreciation she felt now, but she wasn't sure how. She had apologized earlier, but it didn't feel like enough. She didn't know what would be, but something inside her told her it was important. She didn't want to leave without acknowledging the change she had gone through during that short appointment. At the front desk, the receptionist handed her a clipboard to fill out for her follow-up visit. She smiled politely, but the woman could see that her mind was elsewhere. It seemed like everyone in the clinic had their own things to think about, just like her. As she sat down to fill out the paperwork, she found herself staring off into the distance, lost in thought. It was easy to think that this was just an ordinary visit to the doctor, but for her, it had been anything but ordinary. In fact, this one encounter had opened her eyes to something deeper about herself. She realized how easy it was to let assumptions guide her actions without ever stopping to truly understand the person in front of her. But the truth was, the more she thought about it, the more she understood that it wasn't just Dr. Thomas who had changed today. It was her. She finished filling out the forms and handed them back to the receptionist. As she left the clinic, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The entire experience had forced her to confront something she had been avoiding for a long time. The part of herself that judged others based on surface-level impressions. It was a hard truth to face, but one that felt necessary. And as she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, she felt different, changed, in a way she couldn't yet explain, but knew she would carry with her moving forward. The woman wasn't sure what Dr. Thomas thought of her, or if he even remembered the brief moment of discomfort she had caused. But that wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that she had taken responsibility for her own actions and learned from them. She now understood that growth wasn't about avoiding uncomfortable situations. It was about facing them, learning from them, and becoming a better person as a result. In the days that followed, she found herself reflecting on this experience more than once. Every time she did, she felt a quiet pride in knowing that she had taken a step toward becoming more open-minded and aware of her own biases. It wasn't something she could undo, but it was something she could change moving forward. And that was the most important thing. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that clinic that day. She had learned, grown, and most importantly, had learned to appreciate people for who they truly were, not just what she assumed them to be. A few weeks passed after the visit to the clinic, and though the woman had tried to move on, the lessons she had learned stayed with her. Each day, as she went about her routine, her mind would occasionally wander back to that moment in Dr. Thomas's office. At first, she hadn't realized how deeply that experience had affected her, but over time, she began to notice subtle changes in the way she interacted with the people around her. The small moments that used to go unnoticed now seemed more important. She found herself looking at people differently, not just at their faces, but at who they were as individuals. She started noticing qualities that went beyond appearances. It was as though her lens had shifted. She noticed the kindness in the eyes of the grocery store cashier, the patience in her neighbor when they spoke about their kids, and the wisdom in the quiet conversations of people at the coffee shop. She began to appreciate the stories behind the faces, realizing that each person had their own struggles, dreams, and experiences. Everyone she met was more than what they seemed at first glance. One afternoon, she was at the park, taking a walk when she bumped into a friend. The two of them hadn't seen each other in a while, so they stopped to chat. The conversation began like most do, with pleasantries, but soon turned into something deeper as they began discussing recent life events. The woman felt a sense of openness she hadn't noticed in herself before, a new ability to listen without rushing to judgment. She could sense that her friend was going through a tough time, and instead of offering immediate solutions or passing quick judgment, she simply listened. She asked questions and let her friend speak, offering comfort not through words, but through genuine attention. As they spoke, the woman realized that this was how she wanted to live moving forward. She didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was making people feel seen, heard, and valued. She had learned that lesson from Dr. Thomas. The simple act of him listening to her, without judgment, without rushing to conclusions, had left a lasting impression. She had never thought of herself as someone who judged people harshly, but that visit had opened her eyes to the small ways in which she had allowed herself to carry bias, unconscious assumptions about people she didn't even know. Her friend, grateful for the space to share her worries, thanked her for listening so carefully. It was in that moment that the woman felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she had learned. She realized that by simply giving people the opportunity to express themselves without jumping to conclusions, she was not only helping them, but also enriching her own life. Later that week, she ran into a neighbor who worked at a local restaurant. They had exchanged friendly greetings in passing before, but that day they stopped to chat. This time, she found herself taking a step further in the conversation. She asked more about their work and the challenges they faced, rather than just making small talk. As they spoke, she learned that her neighbor had recently faced a personal challenge that she had no idea about. It struck her again how much more there was to people in the surface-level interactions she'd been used to. Her actions may have seemed small, listening more carefully, being more present, but they felt significant to her. It wasn't just about avoiding the mistakes of her past. It was about becoming someone who truly engaged with the world and the people around her, not just as a passive observer, but as an active participant. She knew that her earlier reaction to Dr. Thomas, her initial judgment based on something as shallow as appearance, wasn't something she could simply forget. But she could change, and that was what mattered most. With each day that passed, she felt more connected to the people she interacted with. The small moments, the smiles, the shared stories, the quiet exchanges, became richer. She was learning to be open, to pause and understand, to let go of assumptions and let people show her who they really were. Her experience with Dr. Thomas had taught her that true understanding wasn't about avoiding discomfort or rushing to conclusions, but about taking the time to learn, listen, and grow. And in that, she felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that she was becoming a better version of herself, one conversation at a time. A month had passed since the woman's visit to Dr. Thomas, and although life had returned to its normal pace, something inside her had changed. She couldn't quite explain it, but she knew she wasn't the same person who had walked into that clinic. Her experiences and interactions had taken on a new depth, and her awareness of others, of their stories and struggles, had grown. She felt more connected to the people around her, as if she had stepped out of her own narrow perspective and opened up to the vast world of experiences that others carried with them. One afternoon, she was out running errands, walking down a busy street, when something unexpected happened. She passed a young woman who seemed to be in a hurry, balancing a large coffee cup and a bag of groceries, and as she stepped aside to let her pass, their eyes met. The young woman smiled at her, a brief but genuine smile, and without thinking, the woman smiled back warmly. It was such a simple moment, but it struck her in a way she couldn't explain. The smile wasn't forced. It wasn't a polite gesture. It was a shared, quiet understanding between two strangers. Something in that exchange made her feel like they had connected, if only for a split second, without words or pretense. It reminded her of the importance of those small, human interactions, the ones that often go unnoticed, but have the power to create a sense of belonging and unity. As she continued walking, the woman realized how often she had missed these moments in the past, too focused on her own thoughts, too busy to notice the people around her. But now, she was different. She was present, really present, in her interactions. And for the first time in a long while, she realized that every person she crossed paths with had a story to tell, stories that were just as important as her own. Her thoughts wandered back to Dr. Thomas. She wondered how he was doing, whether he had ever thought about their interaction. She didn't know if he ever noticed the brief hesitation she had shown at the start of their appointment, but she knew that it had made an impact on her. That moment of hesitation, followed by her apology and his kind understanding, had left her with a lasting impression. He had taught her something that went beyond medicine or treatment. It was a lesson in human connection, in seeing people for who they truly were, beyond the surface. In the weeks that followed, she began paying more attention to her own actions and reactions. She noticed when she felt herself slipping back into old habits, like judging a person too quickly or making assumptions based on their appearance. It wasn't that she had suddenly become perfect. She knew that wasn't the case. But she had become more aware of the moments when she had the choice to see people through a more compassionate lens. She had started to ask herself questions like, what is this person really going through? What story do they carry with them? And by doing that, she began to connect with others in a way that felt more genuine, more honest. One day, while waiting in line at a coffee shop, the woman struck up a conversation with the person behind her. It was a small talk at first, just the usual questions about the weather, about how busy the coffee shop was, but it quickly turned into something more. The woman learned that the person behind her had recently lost their job and was struggling to find new work. Instead of offering advice or brushing it off, the woman listened, really listened, to what they had to say. And when the person finished speaking, they smiled as if they had just shared something that had been weighing on them. The woman smiled back, not out of obligation, but because she felt that connection, that understanding. She had learned that sometimes the best way to help someone wasn't with words, but with presence. Just being there, truly listening, without trying to fix things, was enough. It reminded her of her experience with Dr. Thomas, who had done the same for her. Her day continued, but she found herself reflecting on that brief conversation. It had been a simple exchange, but it had left a mark on her. She realized how important it was to show up for people, not just in big ways, but in the small, everyday moments. Those moments of connection, when two people truly see each other, are the ones that make life richer. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always clear, but she knew now that it was worth it. The woman had learned that every interaction, every moment of connection, had the potential to teach her something new, about others, about herself, and about the world around her. It was another quiet evening when the woman found herself sitting at home, reflecting on the changes she had experienced over the past month. It felt like life had slowed down just enough for her to really pay attention to the small, meaningful moments she had once missed. The truth was, she had been so wrapped up in her own world before, running through the motions of her day-to-day life, that she had barely noticed the people around her. But now, after her experience with Dr. Thomas, everything felt different. The shift wasn't just in how she saw others, but in how she saw herself. She'd started questioning the assumptions she had made about people, and she realized that she had often judged others too quickly, based on things like appearance or first impressions. It was as if she had spent so much time focused on herself that she hadn't truly considered what was going on in the lives of others. After her visit to the doctor, she'd learned that real connection came from being present, from listening and understanding without jumping to conclusions. It was a powerful lesson, one that had changed the way she approached every interaction. As she sat on the couch that evening, sipping a cup of tea, she thought about a conversation she had recently had with a coworker. The coworker had opened up about facing some personal struggles and challenges. Instead of offering advice or brushing it aside like she might have done in the past, the woman just listened. She didn't try to fix anything, and she didn't offer solutions. She simply let her coworker talk, offering a few words of encouragement when needed, but mostly just letting them share what was on their mind. It felt like the right thing to do, and afterward, her coworker seemed to breathe a little easier. The woman smiled to herself as she thought about that conversation. It was these small acts of listening, these moments of quiet connection, that were becoming the heart of her interactions now. And she felt a deep sense of peace in knowing that she had been able to be there for someone without making them feel judged or rushed. It wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about showing up for people, being present, and offering understanding. In that moment, she realized that this was what it meant to truly connect with others. The next day, she found herself at the grocery store, picking up a few things for dinner. As she stood in line to pay, she noticed an elderly woman ahead of her, fumbling through her purse. The woman was trying to find her wallet, but seemed to be having difficulty. Without hesitation, the woman stepped forward and offered to help. She could see the frustration in the elderly woman's eyes as she continued searching, and it felt like the right moment to step in. "Do you need help with that?" she asked gently. The elderly woman looked up, surprised but grateful. She smiled and explained that her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, making it hard to find her wallet. The woman helped her locate it, making sure the elderly woman felt comfortable. As they finished the transaction, the elderly woman thanked her, and the woman smiled back, happy to have been able to help in such a simple way. As she left the store, she couldn't help but reflect on that small interaction. It was such a brief moment, but it felt significant. It reminded her that kindness didn't always have to come in grand gestures. Sometimes it was the smallest acts that made the biggest difference. And she realized that this was what she had been learning all along: to be more present, to offer help when needed, and to treat everyone with the same level of respect and understanding. In the weeks that followed, she noticed more moments like this, little opportunities to connect, to show kindness, and to be there for others in ways that felt genuine. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't always have the answers, but she knew that her willingness to listen, to truly see the people around her, was something that had brought her a new sense of fulfillment. That night, as she sat down to reflect again, the woman felt a quiet sense of gratitude. She had learned so much about herself and others, and while she knew she would never stop growing, she was content with the person she had become. She was more aware of the power of human connection, more attuned to the world around her, and more ready to face each new day with an open heart and mind. Her journey had just begun, but she knew she was heading in the right direction. Days turned into weeks, and the woman began to notice more and more how her life was shifting in subtle yet significant ways. The lessons she had learned from her visit to Dr. Thomas were still fresh in her mind, and she felt grateful for the growth that had come from that experience. She didn't just feel more connected to the people around her. She felt more connected to herself as well. It was as if she had shed some old, narrow way of thinking and replaced it with something richer, something that allowed her to see the world through a broader lens. One morning, as she was having coffee at her favorite cafe, she overheard a conversation between two people sitting nearby. They were talking about a mutual friend who had been going through a difficult time. The conversation was casual, but it made her think. The way they spoke about their friend wasn't judgmental or dismissive, but filled with compassion and understanding. They didn't have all the answers, but they were supportive, listening, and offering comfort. It struck her how rare that kind of genuine concern could be in the world. She had heard so many conversations in the past that were full of gossip or judgments, but this was different. It made her realize that there was power in listening and showing care without jumping to conclusions. She couldn't help but smile to herself. That's exactly what she had learned to do, and it had made a difference in her own life. She'd begun to offer that same kindness to others, the same willingness to listen, to give people the benefit of the doubt. And in return, she had noticed that people were more open with her too. Her relationships, whether with friends, family, or even strangers, felt deeper, more meaningful. It wasn't just the people in her life who had started to feel more approachable. It was also her attitude toward herself. In the past, she had often been critical of her own actions and decisions. But now she had learned to be gentler with herself, to recognize her own flaws and mistakes without being harsh. She realized that growth wasn't about being perfect. It was about learning, forgiving, and trying again. This shift in how she viewed herself helped her navigate difficult situations with more grace. When things didn't go as planned, she no longer beat herself up. Instead, she would pause, reflect, and understand that setbacks were simply part of the process. One evening, she met a new neighbor who had recently moved in. It was a casual encounter, but as they spoke, she couldn't help but notice how guarded the neighbor seemed. There was a subtle hesitation in their voice, a reluctance to open up. It wasn't that the woman felt like she had to push for details, but there was something in the neighbor's energy that told her they might be carrying a burden, something unspoken. Instead of rushing to fill the silence with small talk, she simply smiled and said, "It's nice to meet you. If you ever need anything, feel free to reach out." She didn't press for more, didn't try to dive into their personal life, but she let them know that she was there. The neighbor nodded and offered a small smile of their own. And in that moment, the woman could sense a quiet shift. Sometimes, Simply offering space for someone to share without pressure was enough. She didn't need to fix anything, but she could offer kindness, and that was enough. As she walked back to her apartment, she reflected on the interaction. There was something beautiful about those small, subtle connections that she had been able to create. It wasn't about being loud or forceful. It was about being present and letting others know that they were seen. She realized that she had become more patient, more understanding, and that it had made all the difference in her own life. The woman was no longer the person who had walked into that clinic weeks ago, uncertain of herself and quick to judge. She had become someone who truly valued the richness of human connection. She had learned that kindness didn't have to come in grand gestures or big acts. It could be in the smallest, most unspoken moments, where simply being there for someone made all the difference. She knew her journey wasn't over, and there would still be challenges ahead. But with the lessons she had learned about listening, understanding, and offering kindness, she felt ready for whatever came next. Life had become more than just going through the motions. It had become about truly connecting with others and appreciating the beauty in the shared human experience. And that was something she would carry with her, always. As the weeks went by, the woman found herself more deeply immersed in the changes she had made in her life. The simple act of listening, the ability to see others for who they truly were, had become a part of her daily routine. She noticed it in the way she spoke to people, how she would pause before speaking, taking a moment to really hear them. She didn't just rush through her conversations anymore. Whether she was chatting with a coworker about the weather, asking her friend how their day had been, or just making small talk with the cashier at the grocery store, she was genuinely present in those moments, and it felt good. One day, she was on her lunch break at work, sitting by herself in the small park nearby. She enjoyed these quiet moments, the peacefulness of being alone, but today she couldn't help but notice a young man sitting on the bench opposite her. He was holding his phone, scrolling absent-mindedly, but something about him seemed distant. He didn't seem particularly engaged with what he was looking at, and his shoulders were slumped as though the weight of the world was on them. Without thinking, she smiled at him. It was a simple, genuine smile, nothing forced or out of the ordinary. At first, he didn't seem to notice, but after a moment, he looked up, met her gaze, and smiled back. It wasn't a huge smile, but there was something in it that made the woman feel like they had shared a small moment of understanding. Sometimes, a smile could say more than words ever could, and it was clear that in that instant, they had both acknowledged each other as fellow human beings. The woman didn't say anything. She simply returned to her lunch, and soon the young man stood up and walked away. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief interaction had meant something, even if it was just a shared understanding of the quiet struggles each person faced. It reminded her once again of how important those small moments of connection could be, and how often people overlooked them in favor of rushing through their day. She began to realize that life was filled with opportunities to connect, not just with the people closest to her, but with everyone she crossed paths with. It wasn't about grand gestures or making a huge impact. It was about offering kindness and presence whenever possible. It was the small moments, the brief exchanges, that added up and made a difference in the world. As she reflected on this, she thought back to her first meeting with Dr. Thomas. At the time, she had been so focused on her own preconceived ideas that she hadn't given him a fair chance. But he had treated her with such kindness, had listened to her without judgment, and that had left a lasting impact. That experience had been the turning point for her, the catalyst for this new way of seeing the world. And now she was doing the same, offering others the kindness, the space to be heard, and the understanding that she had received. Life was far from perfect, and she still faced challenges. There were days when she slipped back into old habits of impatience or judgment, but now she recognized those moments for what they were. She had learned to be gentle with herself as well, knowing that growth didn't happen all at once. It was a journey, and every step, every small act of kindness, was part of it. One evening, as she was walking home, she noticed an elderly woman struggling with her grocery bags. Without hesitation, she went over and offered to help carry them. The woman smiled gratefully, and together, they made their way to her apartment. It was a simple act, but it felt meaningful. It reminded her that no matter how small the gesture, it was still an opportunity to connect, to make someone's day a little easier. As she continued down her path, she realized that the changes she had made in her life weren't just about seeing others differently. They were about seeing herself differently. She had become someone who wasn't afraid to make those small, quiet connections, someone who didn't shy away from offering kindness or understanding. And in doing so, she'd have found a deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment. Life wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up, being present, and offering what she could to others. Whether it was a smile, a listening ear, or a helping hand, those were the things that truly mattered. And with each passing day, she felt more and more that she was becoming the person she had always wanted to be. Someone who made the world a little brighter, one small act of kindness at a time.